Caleb Dwyer, a single father and experienced flood rescue worker, arrives at Prescott Summit Lodge in his battered 20-year-old Jeep to inspect an unsafe bridge only for CEO Sloane Prescott and COO Rhett Calloway to mock his vehicle. Caleb discovers severe erosion beneath the bridge and recommends immediate closure, but Rhett suppresses previous safety warnings to protect a major investment deal, while Sloane trusts him over Caleb. When a violent storm floods the valley, Sloane's armored SUV becomes stranded beyond the collapsing bridge. Heavy rescue vehicles cannot cross, so Caleb uses his specially modified Jeep to navigate the flood, secure the SUV, rescue Sloane and injured security chief Graham, and escape through an abandoned logging road. Evidence then proves Rhett knowingly ignored warnings and used outdated data to keep the bridge open. When further flooding threatens the entire resort, Sloane finally trusts. Caleb orders an immediate evacuation, suspends Rhett, and saves everyone before mud and water bury the road. Rhett is later fired, safety officer Nora is promoted, and Sloane creates an independent emergency resilience division for Caleb to lead, granting him authority to close dangerous routes regardless of financial pressure. The Jeep she once mocked ultimately becomes the machine that saves both her life and her resort. The Prescott Summit Lodge sat at 8,000 feet, a glass and timber monument to money, its lobby windows tall enough to swallow the whole mountain range in a single sweep of glass. And on that particular afternoon, its front drive was crowded with the kind of vehicles that never got dirty, never idle in a garage waiting to be fixed, never once had to earn their keep. Bentleys gleamed beside chrome-heavy Range Rovers and silent electric SUVs worth more than most houses in the valley below. All of them lined up in a careful row for the biggest announcement in the company's history. A resort expansion investors had been circling for months, hungry for the kind of headline that moved stock. Into the middle of that polished procession rolled a gray Jeep 2 decades old. Its paint faded to chalk, its doors dented in 3 places, dried mud caked thick around the wheel wells like it had crawled straight out of the mountain itself rather than driven up the access road. A young valet moved fast to wave it toward the service entrance, already reaching for a clipboard to note the plate. But Caleb Dwyer barely slowed the vehicle, rolling the window down only far enough to say he was there for Nora Langford and emergency access inspection. Nothing more. And something quiet and certain in his voice made the valet step back without another word. Caleb wasn't there to fix anyone's car, and he wasn't there to be looked at. Nora had quietly hired him weeks earlier to check the resort's backup route and the bridge that fed the pump station on the eastern side of the property. The kind of unglamorous work nobody with a title on the executive floor ever wanted to think about, especially not on the day of a big announcement. I was crouched at his tailgate pulling a toolbox free when Sloane Prescott stepped out through the lobby doors with her chief operating officer Rhett Calloway close behind her, trailing a comet's tail of tailored suits and quiet, expectant conversation. Sloane's eyes caught the Jeep first lingering just a beat too long, and Rhett's laugh came a half-second later, low and easy. The kind of laugh men like him used on other people to make them feel small without ever having to raise their voice. He asked loud enough for the group to hear whether the thing had survived the last century. Sloane said barely, and the investors chuckled along politely because that was simply what you did when the CEO made a joke. And then she turned toward Caleb himself and told him, not unkindly exactly, but not warmly either, that vehicles like his shouldn't really be parked out front while they were entertaining serious guests for an event this important. Caleb didn't argue and didn't flinch. He simply shut the Jeep's door with a solid, unhurried thud and told her that it was a funny thing about ugly equipment, how nobody ever respected it until something far more expensive suddenly stopped working. Sloane assumed he was trying to sound clever, filed the comment away as nothing, and turned back to her guests without giving it another thought, already halfway through her next sentence about square footage and elevation before she even finished crossing the drive. But before Caleb crossed the lot himself, something pulled his eyes up toward the ridgeline where a wall of dark cloud had begun stacking itself against the mountain in a way that made the back of his neck prickle, and he pulled out his phone to check the rainfall forecast, watching the projected number double right there on the screen in the space of 30 seconds. He looked back across the lot at Rhett and asked almost casually whether the East Bridge had been closed yet. Rhett hesitated for 2 full seconds, just long enough for Caleb to notice before saying the bridge was fine. And in that small, careless, Caleb already knew something underneath the surface of that answer was wrong. Caleb and Nora drove out to the eastern route together not long after following a narrow service road that switched back down through pine and wet granite. And it was there, away from the cameras and the champagne glasses being polished behind the lodge bar, that his real skill set finally revealed itself in full. The Jeep wasn't beautiful, and it had never once tried to be, but every piece of it that actually mattered had been rebuilt over years with real purpose. A heavy-duty winch mounted on a reinforced front bumper, locking differentials, front and back oversized tires cut deep for mud and loose rock, a snorkel intake rising above the hood for water crossings. Most stock vehicles would never dream of surviving. Caleb worked the site methodically, the way a man works when he has already through the consequences of getting it wrong, checking the creek level against the old marker stakes, the drainage culverts choked with debris, the soil packed loose around the bridge, footing fresh erosion lines cut into the bank like scars, and a section of guardrail that had begun leaning almost imperceptibly toward the current, a lean you would never notice unless you were looking for exactly that kind of failure. What he found beneath one of the footings stopped him cold. The ground hollowed out by water that had clearly been quietly working away at it for far longer than anyone in a corner office realized or wanted to admit. Nora told him, her voice tight, that she had filed a formal report about the exact same footing 3 weeks earlier and never once heard back from anyone above her. Caleb asked who had signed off on it, and she said the name before he even finished the question, Rhett Calloway, the same name that kept surfacing everywhere. Caleb turned that afternoon like a stone he couldn't step around. He photographed the undercut footing from 3 angles and told her plainly that another 6 in of water and nobody should be driving across that bridge for any reason at all, deal or no deal. Nora admitted almost apologetically that the company was racing to close the expansion deal before morning, and that if the eastern route were officially declared closed, a mandatory structural inspection could delay the entire announcement by weeks, maybe longer. Caleb understood the math behind the silence immediately, the way an entire chain of decisions could bend around a single deadline until safety became just another line item somebody decided to defer. He filed his own emergency report anyway, blunt and unambiguous, recommending immediate closure in language that left no room for interpretation. Then he drove back to the lodge to make sure someone with actual authority heard it directly from him rather than buried in an inbox. Sloane spotted the Jeep pulling back into the lot and asked with a flicker of impatience why he was still on the property at all. Caleb told her flatly that the bridge needed to close right now tonight before the storm got any worse. Rhett cut in before she could even respond, reminding her gently that Caleb was a mechanic, not a structural engineer, and didn't have the credentials to be making that kind of call. Caleb answered without raising his voice even slightly, saying that nobody needed an "and" degree to recognize a river quietly removing the ground out from under a bridge. Sloane didn't much like his tone, the flat certainty of it in front of her guests. But she trusted her own chief operating officer more than she trusted a stranger standing in her parking lot in muddy boots. And when she asked Rhett double-check the numbers, he told her it was already handled, already looked into, nothing to worry about. She believed him instantly, the way people believe the person they've trusted for years. Caleb did not believe him, not for a second. His phone buzzed hard in his pocket with a flash flood warning marked effective immediately, and the first real crack of thunder rolled down off the ridge behind them like the mountain itself agreeing with him. What began as an ordinary mountain rain became within 20 minutes, a wall of water moving through the valley faster than anyone at the lodge had planned for, faster than the drainage systems built into the resort's original design could ever have accounted for. A small landslide closed the main access road entirely, burying half a lane under wet earth and shattered pine. The eastern pump station lost power outright, and a handful of grown employees stationed there began pulling on rain gear and preparing to evacuate on foot before the access road disappeared behind them too. Sloane decided against the advice of nobody at that moment because nobody had thought to advise her otherwise to drive out to the eastern coordination point herself to make sure her people got out safely before anything worse happened. It mattered, and it would matter later, that Sloane wasn't doing this for show or to prove a point to her investors. She genuinely wanted eyes on her own staff, wanted to be the kind of leader who showed up rather than delegated, and there was nothing false in that instinct at all. Graham Pike, her head of security, brought the armored SUV around to the front entrance himself, and Caleb, overhearing the plan from across the lobby, crossed the floor fast and asked immediately which route they intended to take out there. When Graham said the East Bridge, Caleb objected on the spot loud enough now that heads turned. Rhett insisted calm and practiced that the water level was still comfortably under the safety threshold. Holding up his phone to show Sloane a clean current-looking data, read out with numbers that all sat safely in the green. Caleb glanced at the screen over her shoulder and noticed immediately that the timestamp sitting quietly in the corner was nearly 2 hours old. Stale data dressed up to look fresh. Sloane focused entirely on her people, and the clock ticking down toward the investor event didn't catch it, didn't think to ask. And the convoy pulled away from the lodge before Caleb could say another word to stop it. He stood in the rain on the front steps, furious at his own helplessness, unable to physically block a CEO from making her own decision inside her own company, on her own property. About 25 minutes later, communication from the eastern side of the property began cutting in and out as the storm intensified, overhead thunder rolling almost continuously now, and Nora's radio crackled to life with an automated alert marking the East Creek gauge as critical, the word itself blinking red across her screen. She went pale reading it, understanding instantly and completely that the numbers Rhett had shown Sloane in that lobby were nowhere close to what the creek was actually doing in real time, very moment. Caleb was already running for the Jeep when a low, heavy sound rolled through the valley behind them, unmistakable. The sound of a section of hillside letting go somewhere upstream. Then Graham's voice broke through the static on the radio, tight and urgent in a way that cut straight through the noise of the storm, saying the convoy to base the bridge is underwater. The SUV is disabled. We're trapped on the east side. Caleb turned slowly toward Rhett Rain, running off the brim of his cap, something cold settling behind his eyes as he told him he had sent her across a bridge he already knew was failing. The lodge transformed within minutes into a full emergency command post, chairs and conference tables shoved aside to make room for radios and unfurled topographic maps. Fire crews arriving fast, but heavy rescue trucks unable to reach the bridge at all because the approach road had turned soft underneath their own weight and begun sliding away in the long wet sheets. Helicopters were grounded entirely by a low cloud ceiling sheet, lightning cracking across the ridgeline and gusts strong enough to flip a small aircraft on its side, which meant whatever happened next would happen on the ground with wheels and mud and human hands, or it wouldn't happen at all. Rescue teams finally raised Sloane by radio and learned her SUV had died completely on the far side of the bridge, its electronics drowned out by water that had crept up through the undercarriage. A fallen tree blocking the road behind them, so there was no retreat in either direction. Graham injured at the shoulder but still alert and functioning, and the water still rising by the minute. Worse, their exact position sat close to a drainage channel with the real potential to become a genuine flash current within the hour if the rain kept falling at this rate. Caleb asked how deep the water already ran across the bridge deck itself, and Nora checked the last working camera feed before it too dropped offline, reading back somewhere between 8 and 10 inches, already flowing steadily over part of the surface. The on-scene rescue commander said plainly without apology that no heavy truck built for this kind of work could get across that bridge in its current state. A team member named Troy looked straight at Caleb, reading something in his posture, and told him flatly not to even think about it. Caleb wasn't planning to charge blindly into moving water like some kind of reckless hero chasing a headline. He pulled out a folded map, studied the bridge's structure, the wheel clearance. He'd need the angle of the flow against the pilings and the position of the concrete footings he'd already inspected that same afternoon. Then he walked out to the edge of the deck himself on a safety line, boots sinking slightly in the mud, to check the real water level with his own eyes rather than trust a second-hand reading filtered through panic and static. The road surface itself was still structurally intact. He found running his hand along the wet asphalt, and the greatest danger sat not in the deck but in the lateral push of the current and a weakened section of upstream railing that could catch a vehicle broadside if he wasn't careful. Somewhere behind him, a junior firefighter muttered that the old man in the beat-up Jeep had no business volunteering for this, and Troy told him quietly to watch first and judge later. He came back to the group with a short, specific list of demands, a long recovery strap rated well beyond what he'd need, a solid anchor point staged on the western side, a waterproof radio that would actually survive the crossing, a spotter watching the water level continuously and calling it out loud, and an immediate agreement to abort the moment the level rose even slightly further. Rhett objected almost reflexively, worried aloud that if Caleb got hurt out there, the company would carry the liability for allowing it. Caleb looked at him for a long moment and said it was interesting that liability suddenly bothered him now of all nights. Nora backed Caleb without a shred of hesitation, pointing out to the whole room that nobody else on site had a vehicle light enough, high enough off the ground, and properly prepared enough to even attempt something like this. Caleb popped the Jeep's rear hatch, and for the first time everyone standing there, including people who'd laughed at the vehicle only hours earlier, actually saw what was organized inside a full recovery kit laid out with the quiet precision of someone who had done exactly this kind of work before, more than once when the stakes were exactly this high and there had been no room left for mistakes. There were coiled straps rated for loads far beyond anything a normal driver would ever need. A set of traction boards, strapped flush against one side panel, a dry bag holding flares and a second radio wrapped in plastic, and a battered logbook wedged behind the wheel well with dates going back years. Each entry a reminder that this had not been the first storm Caleb had driven into. Rhett stared at the neat rows of equipment and for just a moment said nothing at all, the confident authority draining out of his posture. Graham's voice crackled through the radio again, sharper this time, warning that the water had started to physically move the SUV where it sat. Caleb shut the hatch with a firm click and said without looking up that they were officially out of time to keep talking about it. He shifted the transfer case into 4 low, felt the gears settle with a familiar mechanical clunk, locked both differentials, double-checked the recovery strap, coiled and ready behind his seat, and killed every non-essential electrical draw before rolling the Jeep slowly down toward the water's edge, while the same people who had laughed at it only hours earlier now stood frozen and silent under the awning, watching without a single word between them. The front tires touched the flood first dark water folding up over the tread, and Caleb held a steady, deliberate speed instead of gunning it. The way instinct might have told a less experienced driver to do, knowing that panic behind the wheel was exactly how vehicles lost traction and got swept sideways into the current. Water climbed steadily around the tires as he pushed forward inch by inch, Nora's voice remaining steady over the radio, calling out depth readings every few meters, like a lifeline stretched taut across the storm between them. A heavy branch torn loose somewhere upstream slammed hard into the upstream railing, and the whole bridge shuddered violently under the impact, rattling straight through the Jeep's frame hard enough that Caleb's hands tightened white-knuckled on the wheel for a fraction of a second before he forced himself to keep moving, understanding that stopping now, dead, still in the middle of moving water, was more dangerous by far than simply pushing through it. Near the center of the span, a section of railing tore completely free of its rusted bolts, and the current surged harder against the vehicle's flank without warning, shoving the rear end nearly 2 feet offline in a single sickening lurch before Caleb steered gently into the drift rather than fighting it head-on, holding the throttle steady, and even until the rear tires finally bit back down into solid ground beneath the surface current. Back at the lodge, Rhett watched the whole scene unfold through a pair of borrowed binoculars. And for the first time that day, he began to understand with something close to dread that the thing he'd mocked as a rust bucket only hours earlier was not an ordinary vehicle at all, but something Caleb had spent years quietly reinforcing through hard, practical experience nobody standing in that parking lot could ever have claimed for themselves. A few more meters and the radio dropped out entirely, leaving nothing behind it but the roar of rain hammering the windshield and the low, determined growl of the engine working steadily against the pull of the current. Then at last, the Jeep's headlights broke fully through the sheeting water on the far bank, cutting 2 clean cones of light through the downpour, and the front tires climbed up onto dry pavement on the other side. He had made it across, but before Caleb could even let himself breathe out, he spotted Sloane's SUV ahead, one rear tire already hanging off the crumbling edge of the roadway, the water beneath it actively chewing away more ground with every passing second like something alive and patient. He drove straight for it without slowing. Through the fogged glass of the passenger window, Sloane looked out and recognized the vehicle immediately, the exact same one she had told only a few short hours earlier that it belonged in a scrapyard. Caleb stepped out into the downpour, studied the SUV's angle, studied the current tearing beneath it, and shouted over the noise for nobody to open a single door until he had the vehicle properly secured. A heartbeat later, the SUV slid another few inches toward the edge, and somewhere inside it, Sloane's breath caught in her throat. Through the rain-streaked window, she could see the ground giving way beneath them in slow, sickening increments, each small collapse louder than the last. and for the first time all day she felt something closer to real fear than irritation or inconvenience. The kind of fear that strips away every tation title a person has ever held and leaves only the simple urgent need to survive the next few minutes. Caleb didn't run straight to Sloane because doing this correctly meant doing it in the right order, and the SUV could roll entirely if anyone shifted their weight the wrong way at the wrong moment while it hung half over the eroding shoulder. He repositioned the Jeep first on the firmest patch of ground he could find, then rigged the winch line through a snatch block anchored around a heavy tree trunk to create a cross-angled pull that would hold the SUV steady against gravity and the current both at once. Only after that line pulled taut. Humming faintly under the tension did he finally call for Graham to move first, easing his way out through the door with his injured shoulder held carefully against his body, followed by Sloane, who slipped on the wet edge of the roadway, stepping down and very nearly went over herself before Caleb's hand closed hard around her arm and pulled her back onto solid, stable ground. For a long moment, the two of them simply stood there in the rain looking at each other with none of the usual weight between them. No CEO, no contractor with muddy boots, no titles at all. Nothing but the storm and the black water still rushing past only a few feet away. Sloane glanced past him at the Jeep, rain running down her face, and asked almost in disbelief whether he had actually brought that thing across the flood to reach her. Caleb told her without a trace of a smile. That thing had a name. She very nearly laughed at that something in her chest almost breaking loose despite everything, but the sight of the current still tearing violently at the bridge behind them killed the impulse before it could fully form. He got Graham settled carefully into the back seat and helped Sloane into the front, and she told him, still shaking slightly from the cold and the adrenaline, both simply to take them back the way they'd come. Caleb didn't start the engine right away. He was staring past her over her shoulder at the bridge itself, where a fresh section of asphalt had just sheared cleanly away from the edge and dropped without a sound into the current far below. They weren't going back that way, he told her quietly, and Sloane felt something cold settle deep in her chest as she understood all at once that the crossing Caleb had just fought so hard through was already failing behind them for good, which meant all three of them were now stranded together on the far side of the valley, while the water kept climbing steadily around them with no sign of slowing down. Caleb chose an old logging road that curved up and around the mountainside, long since abandoned and half swallowed by brush and young pine, barely visible unless you already knew exactly where to look for it. When Sloane asked how he even knew it existed, her voice quieter now than it had been all day, he told her he'd worked flood rescue in this exact region years earlier before life pulled him in a different direction entirely. It was here, winding through mud and standing water in the cramped, rattling cab of that old Jeep, that his past finally surfaced without any need for melodrama or memory dressed up for effect. Caleb had raised a child alone for years, carrying that particular weight of responsibility by himself long enough that it reshaped every choice he made afterward, including walking away from steady promotions and predictable corporate paths in favor of work that let him control his own hours and stay close to what actually mattered to him, rather than what looked impressive on paper. There was no flashback here, no staged scene of a child sitting beside him. Only a handful of plain, unadorned sentences that let Sloane understand for the first time all day exactly why a man like Caleb had never once cared about job titles or the price tag stitched into the leather of somebody's seat. Something in this way. She looked at him, changed after that, quieter and far more honest than anything that had passed between them back at the lodge that morning. The Jeep ground steadily over rock-thick mud and washed-out ruts that her SUV never would have survived even in dry conditions, and when a small tree blocked the narrow path in entirely, Caleb hooked the winch cable to it without a word and dragged it aside without breaking stride, barely slowing the vehicle at all. While he worked outside in the rain, Sloane, searching the back seat for a spare radio, found a sealed waterproof folder tucked behind a side panel, and inside it a formal report titled East Bridge Urgent Failure Risk, addressed directly to Rhett Calloway and time-stamped 36 hours earlier, long before any of this had begun. She looked up at Caleb through the open-door rain dripping from her hair and asked very quietly if he had known. Caleb didn't answer right away, choosing his words the way a careful man chooses them. It had been Nora who first requested the inspection, suspicious that the internal data no longer matched what she was seeing with her own eyes out on the ground, and Caleb had documentation to back every bit of it up. Photographs of the undercut footing the clogged culvert, hairline cracks spreading slowly through the surrounding earth. and a formal recommendation to close the route immediately filed and ignored. Sloane understood then all at once that Rhett hadn't simply misjudged the risk in a moment of poor timing. He had known about it clearly and kept the bridge open anyway, unwilling to let anything, including her own safety, threaten a deal closing that same night. She asked Caleb quietly why he hadn't told her sooner, why he hadn't pushed harder, and he said simply that he had tried, and the words landed harder than anything else said between them that entire night, because she remembered exactly how she'd laughed at his Jeep in that parking lot and barely let him finish a single sentence before turning away. Caleb eventually found his way back to the resort through the old forest route, headlights bouncing over ruts and standing water, and people came running the moment the Jeep's beams cut through the rain toward the entrance drive. Sloane climbed out first, soaked through and steady on her feet despite everything, and Rhett moved quickly to seize control of the narrative before anyone else in the room could speak first, accusing Caleb loudly of violating protocol, driving through a restricted zone without authorization, and exposing the entire company to serious legal liability on the worst possible night. Sloane said nothing at first, arms crossed, watching him carefully, and Rhett mistook her silence for quiet agreement, turning immediately to security and ordering them to get Caleb off company property right now tonight, no exceptions. Graham, whose shoulder Caleb had just helped carry safely across a collapsing bridge less than an hour earlier, didn't move a single inch from where he stood. When Rhett barked that he had given a direct order, Graham looked him steadily in the eye and told him plainly that he wasn't his CEO and he never had been. Sloane finally stepped forward and picked up the waterproof folder Caleb had handed her on the ride back, setting it down deliberately on the table in of Rhett, and asking him evenly and without raising her voice at all exactly when he had first received it. Rhett began to lie smoothly and almost instinctively the way he must have practiced doing for years. But Nora was already pulling up the internal email logs on her tablet, turning the screen so everyone in the room could see it clearly, showing the report had he reached his office well before the storm had even begun building over the ridge. It had then been quietly flagged non-critical deferred until after the investor event in his own handwriting on the digital record. Something in Sloane went cold as she read the label herself, understanding in an instant exactly how deliberate the entire decision had been. Not an oversight, not bad luck, but a choice made in a warm office while people out on that mountain had no idea what was coming for them. Before she could say another word or decide exactly what to do with what she now knew, an alarm cut hard through the lodge and a far bigger problem announced itself over every speaker in the building at once. Water pouring off the mountainside had shifted direction entirely and was now heading straight toward the resort itself. And if the northern drainage system overflowed the way the eastern one already had, the main access road would be cut completely, leaving dozens of employees and guests, every one of them a grown adult with a life waiting somewhere below, stranded exactly where they stood with nowhere left to go. Caleb studied the site map spread across the table, tracing the contour lines with one finger, and told Sloane flatly that she had maybe 40 minutes before it hit. What had been a corporate reckoning only seconds earlier became, without any warning at all, a full and immediate evacuation. Rhett immediately argued against evacuating at all, his voice rising for the first time that night, warning that declaring a full emergency evacuation the night before a deal would spook every investor in the building and could collapse the entire agreement they had spent a year building toward. He urged Sloane instead to wait for more data before committing to anything so drastic in public. It was the exact same reasoning word for word almost that had put a bridge underwater hours earlier and nearly killed her along with 2 other people. Sloane looked over at Caleb standing quietly by the map with rain still dripping from his sleeves, and he didn't tell her what to do, didn't push or plead. He only offered simply that she already knew by now exactly what waiting had cost them once already that same night. It was the moment that finally completed her arc as a leader in full. The instant she stopped weighing appearances against reality and simply chose the second one without hesitation. She picked up the radio, keyed it, and gave the order to evacuate the resort immediately. No delay, no further discussion, no committee vote. When Rhett accused her right there in front of everyone of destroying the company with her own 2 hands, she told him steadily that a company could recover from a bad quarter, but people didn't recover from being buried under a mountain. And with that, she suspended his authority on the spot in front of the entire room, effective immediately. Caleb led the convoy out along the safer western route he'd already scouted once that day, but a maintenance gate lost power, partway through the drive, and locked the entire line of vehicles in place, with no time left to bring system back online through normal means. Caleb brought the Jeep up close to the gate, hooked the winch to the bent locking mechanism with practiced speed, and dragged the housing clean off its rail until the gate finally swung open under the strain, and the vehicles began rolling through one after another into the darkness beyond. Moments after the last car cleared the low ground behind them, a wave of water and mud surged violently across the exact stretch of road they had just abandoned, burying it completely in seconds, snapping a young sapling in half as easily as a person might snap a twig underfoot. Somewhere behind them, a security guard let out a low whistle at how close the timing had actually been, and nobody answered him because everyone standing there understood exactly how close it was without needing the words spoken out loud. Sloane stood beside Caleb in the rain, watching it happen, any lingering doubt gone completely from her mind for good. He had been right from the very first moment he'd looked up at those clouds gathering over the ridgeline that afternoon. The Jeep hadn't simply saved her life once out on that flooded bridge earlier that night. It had just cleared the path that saved everyone else's too. In the weeks that followed the storm, an internal investigation moved through Prescott Alpine Resorts with quiet, methodical force pulling apart months of decisions, one careless email at a time, and Rhett Calloway was terminated once the evidence made his choices impossible to defend to the board. The buried safety warnings, the quietly downgraded priority flags, the delayed maintenance requests, and the pressure he had applied to his own operations team to keep the project locked to its original schedule no matter what it cost anyone standing in its way. None of that turned into a long, drawn-out story of revenge, because the true heart of what had happened that night had never really belonged to him in the first place. It belonged to Caleb and to Sloane, and to what each of them had quietly learned about the other once the storm stripped away every polished surface standing between them. Nora was promoted into a senior safety role with direct authority over every future report filed on that mountain. And Graham, once his shoulder finally healed, made it a point to tell anyone who would listen that the man in the ugly Jeep had earned more respect in one night than most people managed in an entire career. A few weeks later, Caleb drove back up to the Prescott Summit Lodge on a clear, dry afternoon, the Jeep looking almost exactly the way it always had. The mud finally washed away, but the dents and scrapes still visible along its flanks like a record nobody had bothered or wanted to erase. A valet came jogging toward him across the drive, and for a moment Caleb braced himself out of old habit for the same routine. Another polite request to park somewhere out of sight around back. Instead, the young man told him that Miss Prescott had said to park right up front, no exceptions, and left it at that. Sloane was already waiting near the lobby entrance, arms crossed loosely watching him climb out. She told him she had established an entirely independent infrastructure and emergency resilience division, separate from the operations chain that had failed everyone so badly that night, and that she wanted Caleb to lead it full authority, no interference from above. He wasn't especially interested in becoming an executive in a tailored suit behind a desk somewhere, and he told her so plainly, but he agreed on one condition that mattered more to him than any salary she could offer, that if he ever declared a route unsafe again, no CEO, no chief operating officer, and no investor anywhere in the company would ever again have the authority to force it open for the sake of money. She added almost as an afterthought that the division would carry his name on its founding charter, whether he liked the idea or not, and Caleb told her flatly that he'd think about it, though the faint curve at the corner of his mouth said he'd already decided. Sloane put out her hand without hesitation and said simply, "Deal." Before Caleb climbed back into the driver's seat, she glanced once more at the old Jeep parked crooked in the middle of her pristine front drive and told him quietly that she owed that rust bucket her life, and she meant every word of it. Caleb raised an eyebrow and warned her, almost smiling now, to be careful because it held grudges. Sloane laughed genuinely this time, the sound easy and unguarded in a way it hadn't been back at the beginning of all this. As Caleb opened the door, she asked, half-joking, whether he was ever planning to replace it. He looked at the vehicle that had carried him through the flood and back again and asked her quietly, replace it with what? Then he climbed in, and the old engine caught on the very first turn of the key. Steady and sure, exactly the way it always had. Storm or no storm, mud or dry pavement, the world watching or nobody watching at all. Sloane stood in front of a resort worth hundreds of millions of dollars and watched that old Jeep pull away down the long drive toward the gate. its taillights fading into the trees, and for the first time in her life, she truly understood something Caleb had known all along, long before she ever laughed at him, standing in that parking lot on an ordinary afternoon that had nearly ended in disaster. A price tag can only ever tell you how expensive something looks polished and new, under showroom light admired for exactly as long as nothing ever goes wrong around it. It takes everything falling apart around you. The rain, the failing bridge, the silence of people who should have spoken up sooner to finally tell you what something or someone was actually worth all along.